Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I've just had a really lovely time. I've met so many interesting people and I've heard so much. And in the past, when I was younger, I always wanted to talk first in these conferences to get the paper, out of the way, then I could relax. And now I'm a bit older, I like to talk a bit later because I can hear what the conversations are and what people are interested in and what they need us to talk about. And I was thinking last night, how can I, a historian, someone who's interested in history and philosophy, how can I be useful to you all as people who think about design and people who practice design? And something I thought about was something that Peter said yesterday. He said, you can use some of these ideas as tools to think with, when you're coming up with an idea, it's just one extra thing in your toolbox that can be there for you to think with. And something else that came to mind was, when we talk about emotions, because we're all here talking about emotions, that perhaps some of what I might say today can be there as part of the conversation in your mind when you're making assumptions and making claims about emotions and what it is that you really mean when you use the word emotion. So that's how I hope that this will be useful, but let's see. I like to start my talks with a little experiment, if you don't mind. It's very, very easy. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and see if you can work out what emotion or emotions you're feeling right now. Now, you're not going to need to tell anyone or anything. This is just to see how easy or perhaps hard you find it to pinpoint exactly what you're feeling. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to do this. Okay? Okay, let's go. Okay, that time is up. I wonder how it went. Maybe you felt a little embarrassed. Maybe you enjoyed it, had a little moment of respite. Maybe you felt a little bit wary as everyone else got their eyes closed. Maybe you remembered a phone call you were supposed to make this morning or an argument you had. Maybe you felt a little bit of this. Sorry, that's my title. Maybe you felt a little bit of this. This is a German word, Torschlusspanic, which no doubt I'm saying slightly wrong. That means gate-closing panic, the sense that time is about to run out and, oh God, I haven't had an emotion yet. Perhaps you detected the aftershocks of a little feeling of this emotion, malu. This is a feeling of being flustered and tongue-tied when you're talking to someone that you'd quite like to impress, perhaps out there in the lobby. Perhaps, hopefully, you also felt this, Geselligkeit. This is the pleasure of being among friends. So we all at this conference spend a lot of time thinking about emotions. And perhaps, like me, you sometimes fantasize about the idea that you can kind of hold an emotion in the palm of your hand and really look at it as if you're looking at an object. And I think that we are encouraged to think this way by the culture that we live in now. We've heard already today about AI, emotion recognition software. Certainly we might think about eye-tracking devices or programs that can scour our faces looking for micro-expressions. Now, there are many issues with this technology. We all know that it has learned and inbuilt biases, that its errors are greatest when it comes to recognizing people of color, gender diverse people, people with disabilities or living with illnesses. I think there is a further problem with this kind of technology, which is that it makes us think that emotions are way simpler things than they really are. I want to make a different kind of proposition about emotions. I want our emotions to be extraordinary again. Now, because I know that I'm the only historian in the room, I'm going to take the liberty of introducing you a little bit to what I mean when I talk about the history of emotions. What even is that? So I'm going to talk a bit about the history of emotions, and then I'm going to give you a particular example. And the example I'm going to give you is a history of joy and laughter, and something I'm calling dangerous joy. Okay, so what is the history of emotions? So what does it mean to say that emotions have histories. We think of emotions as something which are timeless and universal. And in fact, quite a few of the speakers over the last couple of days have mentioned that emotions seem to be universal things. But if we look at the past, we can see that the emotional languages and our ideas about emotions have changed very dramatically. There have been some emotions which used to be very widespread, which no longer exist. The monks who lived in the Sinai desert in the 1st and 2nd centuries spoke of this emotion, acidi or acidia. It describes a very kind of particular listlessness and despair that would descend on the monks, but only around lunchtime. So this is a very specific sort of emotion with very particular symptoms, and they don't very straightforwardly map onto any emotion that we exactly have today. So we'd call this a lost emotion. And there are other emotions which were expressed very differently in the past to how we express them today. This is a line from a troubadour poet in the 12th century in France. A lot of troubadours spoke of yearning so much for their beloveds that they yawned for them. You know, no one yawns out of love anymore, I don't think. In the 16th, I mean, of course, our ideas about what causes emotions have changed very dramatically. In the 16th century, doctors spoke of strange liquids and vapors in our bodies, which would cause these strange passions. And it gave rise to all kinds of intriguing theories, like getting angry might be the secret to eternal youth, and that men who could grow these kinds of luxuriant beards had an excess of courage. And some emotions seem to affect us differently, and some were much stronger in the past. In the 19th century, people across Europe died from nostalgia. At that time, nostalgia was a very powerful form of homesickness. And medical treatises like this one, which was a bit earlier actually, were written about it. So it was a very serious medical diagnosis. Now, today, nostalgia would not appear on a death certificate, but nor would homesickness. So there's a sense that an emotion in the past is treated more seriously and given more status than perhaps it might be today. And of course, you know, some emotions have been lost, and then, of course, new ones have been invented, and we've heard about that spectacularly, I think, today. Some of my favourite examples in that talk. This is another favourite. This is rap rage, the red mist that descends when you're trying to open one of these packages. As designers, I thought you might appreciate that particularly. And of course, we've heard a lot about the extraordinary new languages around climate change. This is one, flugskam. This is the Swedish word that means the shame of flying by aeroplane. So emotions change across time, and they change across places. And of course, there are those very famous untranslatable emotions. When Chopin was asked, what emotion causes the extraordinary intensity of your music? He said, it's the Polish emotion, żal. I hope I'm saying that right, żal. He said, according to Litz, who wrote his biography, Chopin said, żal is the soil of my heart. I could find no appropriate expression for this word except for in Polish. This word was only available to him in Polish. And Litz is very romantic. He says, as if his ears thirsted for the sound of this word, which expressed a whole range of emotions produced by intense regret. It goes through all the shades of feeling, from hatred to repentance. And so Chopin repeated this word over and over again. Żal, żal, you know. Anyway. So all this raises the question.
To nasuwa pytanie zatem.
And when they use different words for them, do they feel them differently too? Can I feel żal in the same way that Chopin did? I don't think so. I certainly don't yawn out of love. I would be very surprised if anyone I knew died from nostalgia. So you might think I'm just talking about language here and I'm just talking about words rather than emotions. But this gets to the heart of what we think an emotion really is. One way to think about emotions is to see them as simple reflexes, triggered by external predicament. So, for example, we see a bear. That sets off a whole set of physiological responses in the body. Our heartbeat raises, our pupils dilate, maybe we run, maybe we freeze. And it is our subjective sensation or awareness of those physiological changes that we call fear, that we call the emotion. That's one way of thinking about emotions. But as we've already heard, in fact, this morning, there's a more sophisticated and complex way of thinking about emotions that has become very important in neuroscience recently. So I was also wanting to mention the neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett. She has written very persuasively that emotions are cognitive phenomena. They are elastic systems. They're shaped not only by our bodies and by our reactive bodies, but also by our thoughts, by our languages, by our concepts. So our feelings occur in a kind of set of surges and visceral experiences, and we do use language to organize those experiences into something that feels meaningful. But the fact that we've created a name for it then also exists in a looping effect. It can then create impacts on our bodies again. So it's not a one-way traffic, it's a two-way traffic. So I recently read a really nice example of this, I thought, by the American Buddhist nun Pema Chodron. A few years ago, she was meditating, and she was having very unpleasant feelings during her meditation. And she called these anxiety, and she was very unhappy about it. And she went to her teacher, and her teacher listened to her symptoms and listened to what she had to say. And he said, "Oh, that's not anxiety, that's the Dukkini bliss. That's high-level spiritual bliss." She was like, wow, and she was so excited. She ran home to meditate, and sadly, she never had the experience ever again. But this is a good example of how the storylines and narratives we have about an emotion can change our subjective experience of them. In Pema Chodron's case, of course, it went from being something that was very desirable and very undesirable and unpleasant to being something that was very desirable, something that she wanted to have. So this is, as the historian Barbara Rosenwein says, because emotions are inchoate until they are given names, emotional vocabularies are very important for the ways in which people understand, express, and indeed feel their emotions. Okay, so this is partly why us historians are very interested in language. We think of emotion words as something called emotives. This concept comes from a philosophical idea that language doesn't just describe things, but it also performs, it acts on the world. If you say, "I love you," or "I'm sorry," or you propose something, or you congratulate someone, or you warn someone, then you are changing something in the world. And when we think or utter an emotion word, we are also transforming something in the world. We're transforming our own sensations, and we are activating a whole set of beliefs and expectations and values in the community in which we are uttering those words. So we can think of emotives as a kind of practice. And if you're interested in this kind of idea, this is a very interesting paper about thinking of emotions as a kind of practice. Now, of course, there are lots of practices around emotions, and these practices bring emotions into life and make them disappear again. This is an interesting one, our Wumbuk. This is an emotion that's experienced by the Baining people of Papua New Guinea. This is a kind of lethargy and exhaustion and heaviness that descends when a house guest finally leaves. Now, you or I might feel relief, but the Baining people believe that house guests, when they leave, in order to travel more easily, they have to shed a kind of heaviness, And this heaviness infects the air. So what the Baining do is they leave a bowl of water out overnight. And the water is said to absorb this heavy air. And then the next morning they go and they throw this water away in the forest. They have a ritual. And that gets rid of the Awumbuk. So here is an example of an emotion that is really brought into being because of a whole set, and made to disappear again, because of a whole set of languages, rituals, practices. They're all conspiring to bring an emotion to life and make it disappear again. So I hope it's clear now that historians begin with the assumption that emotions are not universal phenomena or cannot be straightforwardly a universal phenomena, but are also cultural practices with their own histories. And more than that, I think, once we sort of accept that premise, then we can be interested in how these emotional practices intersect with larger historical changes. How do emotions then become the driver of historical change? And so now I want to turn to the history of smiling, cheerfulness, and dangerous joy. So when I and my fellow historians are trying to understand the deep histories of emotions, we look at languages and rituals and objects and buildings and artwork and all sorts of things. But we also look a lot at what the historians Peter and Carol Stearns called emotionologies. This is a rather pompous term that we invented. So emotionologies just mean the rules that govern what emotion is appropriate and what is not. So anthropologists call this display rules, but we think of it more as what are you allowed to feel in any given circumstance. It's not just about what you show, it's also about what you're allowed to feel. Here's an example. So when the French artist Madame Lebrun, she was a close personal friend of Marie Antoinette, when she exhibited this self-portrait with her daughter in 1787, it caused a scandal. Can you have any idea why? Not only was she smiling, only slightly, and I appreciate you can't really see this, but you can just see a tiny bit of her teeth, just a tiny bit. Okay, so this is why it caused a scandal, because you could see her teeth and because she was smiling. So for centuries, portraits had showed somber faces with mouths enigmatically clamped shut. But by the 1780s, French aristocrats were really keen to be painted looking relaxed and jovial. The revolution was, of course, just around the corner, but it wasn't that these aristocrats were oblivious. They felt the change in emotional tone, and they recognized that the rules were changing. For centuries, sorrow, not joy, had been the respectable emotion. Early modern authors even advised people to be more sorrowful. So Robert Burton's famous Anatomy of Melancholy, that was published in 1621. This ends with a Latin inscription that translates, if you're miserable, you can hope. But if you're happy, you should beware. So no happiness here. Looking sad was associated with being substantial, with being God-fearing, with being humble, because it was said the melancholy humour weighed the body down and brought you closer to the earth, the humus, so you were more humble. But also people didn't like laughter because there were issues of rotten teeth and bad smells. In the 16th century, Erasmus said it was unseemly to laugh in such a way as your whole body shook with passion, and you should never ever open your mouth. Exuberant laughter was associated with children, with women, with the common people, and especially with other races. So one traveller in the 17th century wrote back of the strange and offensive laughter of the women of Persia, who apparently were laughing so hard during their dinner that the meat from their mouth flew out onto the plate. So these women were having a great time, but for the elite European men and women, laughter was barbaric. So why did these French aristocrats start grinning? Well, according to the historian Colin Jones, it was partly because of a larger emotional shift in Europe at that time. In the early 1700s, a new generation of Enlightenment philosophers began to speak of liberating themselves from the gloom of the church. One must laugh at everything, said Voltaire. Later, the revolution would be described as being motivated by a sacred love for humanity. These philosophers were creating what the historian Barbara Rosenwein calls an emotional community. They were creating a new set of emotional rules, and that if you wanted to belong to this new community, you also had to feel these same feelings and demonstrate them. I think this question of rules is really important for designers, actually, because it's a question about what we do when we break the rules. Do we want to facilitate people breaking the rules? Do we want to make the rules easier to adhere to? What are the rules themselves quite oppressive? These are really important questions to ask ourselves when we're thinking about creating emotional objects or emotional spaces and so on. What are the rules that we're playing into here? In any case, in the 1700s then, by the 1780s, aristocrats wanted to show that they were part of this new emotional community too. They wanted to appear progressive and egalitarian, and their smiles were a way of showing that they had great love for all mankind. And also, because they wanted the best of both worlds, they wanted to show off their expensive new porcelain teeth, because there had been improvements in dentistry in the period of time, and they were the only ones who could afford it. Anyway, as we know, there was about to be a big revolution, so smiling was not going to be enough. So this is part of the history of smiling, but there is no overarching history of emotion. You know, there is no the history of smiling, there is only a history of smiling, okay? Like all histories, history of emotions are a patchwork of perspectives and experiences. And in any historical moment, multiple emotional communities exist at once. And people belong to many emotional communities at the same time, and they code switch between them. And sometimes they just ignore all the rules altogether, you know, of course. So French aristocrats stopped smiling very fast. But in the 20th century in America, there was a real reawakening of cheerfulness and smiling. This is a photograph of an experiment that was carried out in the Hawthorne plant of the Western Electric Company in Chicago in 1927. This was a vast and bureaucratic corporation that supplied parts for telephones, which were a new commodity at that time. And when this photograph was taken, it employed 29,000 workers from 60 nationalities. These were the immigrants who provided the cheap labor on which modern America was built. Now, 4 of the women actually in this photograph are Polish. The 5th is from a Czech family, and the 6th was born in Norway. They were all 19 or 20 years old, and they were all single, except for one who was 28 and engaged. And their job was to put together the very small relays for telephones. Each one took 1 minute for them to make. So we've heard about emotional objects, and we've heard about the emotions of the designers, and we've heard loads about the emotions of the users, but here are the emotions of the people manufacturing the objects. The psychologists came to the factory to study worker productivity. In the coming months, every possible variable that might affect efficiency was measured. The light, the temperature in the room, the frequency and timing of breaks, what they ate for dinner, what they had for lunch, what they did the night before, the amount of sleep they had, everything they measured. And there was an observer in the room the whole time who wrote everything down. The only thing they didn't really measure was the women's emotions. But the emotions weren't really part of the study. They just didn't think they were going to be important. But it became clear that they were the most important thing in the whole study. Quickly, these women started to get on each other's nerves. They started to annoy each other. 2 women in particular became very hostile and resentful of the experiment. And they spent about 75% of the time talking and laughing. And they were poking fun at the psychological observer in the room. And unsurprisingly, their output slowed down. And they eventually, these 2 women were replaced by other women. And then the atmosphere shifted a bit. And by April 1928, the observer in the workroom noted that now the women were actually becoming quite friendly with each other, and they were all spending time together outside of work. They were having parties and going to each other's homes. And this seemed to mark a new phase of collaboration, and the productivity increased. Crucially, according to the observer, the women seemed more cheerful, and they were enthusiastic, and they were smiling. I don't know if you recognize this in Poland. I don't know. But in London, I recognize this. You know, that in the last 20 years, the imperative to be more cheerful at work has raised up. You know, we have to all be a lot more upbeat and cheerful. This began in the 1930s. So this experiment is the beginning, I think, of what Eva Illus calls in her book Cold Intimacies, the beginning of emotional capitalism. Emotional capitalism is a culture in which emotional and economic discourses and practices mutually shape one another. So we come to understand that making money involves emotional labor, right? But we also come to understand that our emotional relationships with one another can be interpreted as or understood as forms of exchange. And sometimes we use metaphors of financial exchange to understand our emotional relationships. So it's both, emotional capitalism is both a question of emotional labor in the workplace and in using the workplace as a metaphor to think about our private lives. So emotional capitalism depends on the idea that emotions can be isolated, investigated, manipulated, and controlled in the service of corporate profit. This is what, in order for emotional capitalism to work, we have to believe that emotions can be controlled. And it is an environment where maintaining emotional states, in this case, maintaining cooperativeness and cheerfulness, is part of labor, is part of work. And psychologists distinguish between the first laughter of the first 2 women who were laughing, and that laughter was very disruptive, to the second group of women whose laughter was considered very cooperative and pleasant. So even different kinds of laughter are being diagnosed here. As Ali Hochschild, who I'm sure you've come across, who writes on emotional labor, she put it, seeming to love the job becomes part of the job. Okay, so seeming to love the job becomes part of the job. Okay, so when we have these new emotional regimes or new emotional communities with their rules, then we get, of course, people who do not conform. These are people that Sarah Ahmed calls affect aliens. So an affect alien is someone who experiences shame or difficulty when they sense that their emotions are out of step with the expected emotional community or the expected mode. An affect alien finds that the things that are supposed to make them happy do not make them happy. So Ahmed identifies stereotypes Our culture imposes stereotypes on people who fail to emotionally conform. A very famous example is the feminist killjoy, of which I am very much one. So a feminist killjoy might, for example, be at a wedding, and instead of enjoying it, she might think, oh, this is all about the patriarchy. I feel uncomfortable. That's your feminist killjoy. And then another affect alien that Ahmed identifies is the melancholic migrant. So this is when people put stereotypes onto other people who are not conforming to the expected emotions. And this melancholic migrant was, of course, sorry, let me go back to this picture. She was, of course, a very important part of the emergence of emotional capitalism. It was her emotions that were being debated about right at the beginning. Okay. So from the 1920s and 30s, housewives, office staff, factory workers all found themselves exhorted to be more happy at work. And it even extended to presidents. This is Harding in 1921, very serious. Coolidge, very serious. Hoover, maybe smirking. Roosevelt, very serious. Truman, maybe slightly smiling a little bit. Eisenhower, definitely smiling. And of course, Kennedy, he's just the big grin. And then after that, almost, except for two, every American president smiles with their teeth in their official portraits. So in some sections of American society, everyone was encouraged to smile and be upbeat. But others were cautioned against being too happy. In his 1905 conduct manual for African American children, the African American pastor, Dr. Silas Floyd, warned his young female readers against becoming one of the loud girls, as he put it. A loud girl was someone that he met on the buses in Georgia where he lived. He complained that these girls, with their exuberance and their jokes and their playing around, and the pleasure they were taking in being young and free, he said they ought to restrain their emotions and behave more appropriately. For him, it was partly a question of moral and gender propriety, but it was also a question of safety. Given the racist policing of the state, these young black women were disproportionately arrested on nights out with friends. So laughter and having fun made you conspicuous, and it made you a target. And that was part of the reason why he was encouraging these young girls to not demonstrate pleasure or joy. So there is a politics to joy. There's a history to joy, and there is a politics to joy, and who is entitled to feel it. And part of the civil rights movement by the 1950s and 60s was a move to embrace public joy and use joy as a way of resisting oppression. So you might see these young black women and one man on the New York subway as affect aliens. They were embracing pleasure and joy in public in a way that had been discouraged both by black moral leaders and also by white communities for whom black people's laughter was historically a sign of disobedience. So the idea I want to end with is this. Emotions don't just change across time, and they don't just reflect larger political changes. They also become agents of historical change. They create historical change. And as designers who are interested in design and emotion, I think you have quite an extraordinary role to play in this creation of change through emotion. So I hope I've given you a bit of an insight into what the history of emotions is about. And perhaps I've given you some ways of thinking that might be useful in your own research and in your own practice. Recognizing the deep cultural narratives around our emotions matters more than ever at this time when the debate about feelings seems to grow more simplistic, more straightforward, more reduced. I hope I've persuaded you that these histories and cultures of emotion matter deeply. They are not simply questions of us interpreting our emotions, but they are integral to the feelings that we are able to have. The cultures we inhabit and which inhabit us in return are part of what emotions are. This is what an emotion is. And attending to these cultural narratives allows us to keep diversity in the forefront of our minds, and to recognize that emotions aren't just fixed things and one label is not going to work for everyone, but that they are shaped by these multiple overlapping and sometimes conflicting emotional communities. And I think that if we pay attention to these narratives, that's how we can make emotions extraordinary again. Okay, thank you.